Cognitive dissonance in a polarized age, from Festinger's 1950 experiments to today's social media echo chambers introduction. The clash of beliefs and reality. Imagine a devoted believer whose prophecy fails to come true. Dawn breaks with no promised apocalypse. What do? In 1954, social psychologist Leon Festinger and colleagues infiltrated a doomsday cult led by a woman called Mistress Keach, who predicted the end of the world on a specific date when the cataclysmic flood did not occur. The most committed followers didn't abandon their belief. They doubled down almost immediately. They began calling newspapers and seeking converts, claiming their faith had saved the world. Far from being discouraged by disconfirming evidence, the group rationalized the failed prophecy as proof of their special role, thereby reducing the mental discomfort of being wrong. This strange episode illustrates a powerful psychological phenomenon that affects us all. Cognitive dissonance in our increasingly polarized age of fake news. We often cling to beliefs even when reality pokes holes in them. An understanding why can shed light on everything from stubborn political views. In this video essay, we will explore how cognitive dissonance works and why people double down on beliefs in the face of conflicting evidence. Like the famous $1 versus $20 lying experiment and the when prophecy fails case study, to today's social media echo chambers that reinforce our worldviews along the way. We'll connect cognitive dissonance. We'll see how modern phenomena such as political polarization, conspiracy movements, including Tavris Aronson, Dan Kahan, Jonathan Haidt, Zeynep Tufekci, and others will guide us in linking the psychological theory to real-world behavior. Most importantly, we'll discuss how recognizing our own cognitive dissonance. Let's start by examining how the theory of cognitive dissonance was born. Festinger's theory, when beliefs and reality conflict, in the late 1950s. At its core, the theory holds that inconsistency among our beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. Much like mental stress, this dissonance is something we are motivated to reduce. We crave consistency between what we think, feel, and do. If two ideas or an idea and an action clash, for example, I am a smart person and I just did something very foolish, we experience inner conflict. To relieve that tension, we adjust our attitudes or interpretations. The doomsday that never came, when prophecy fails. Festinger's interest in these psychological gymnastics. Keach has mentioned her followers had radically rearranged their lives in preparation for a prophesied UFO rescue from a world-ending flood. They were deeply committed. Some quit jobs and gave away money, which meant a huge investment of identity and pride in the belief. Festinger predicted that if the prophecy failed, the most fervent believers would not renounce the cult. Instead, they would rationalize the failure. When the earth stayed intact, the group decided their faith had averted disaster and immediately sought validation by spreading the word to others. They added supportive consonant thoughts. See, others agree we were right to believe, to drown out the dissonance from the blatant evidence that they were wrong. This real-life case study, later documented in The greater the commitment to a belief, the more forcefully people may reject or reinterpret contradictory facts to preserve their worldview. Festinger noted that the cult members' about faith, from secrecy to proselytizing, served an important psychological purpose. It wasn't mere hypocrisy, it was a coping mechanism. By seeking social support for their belief, they could convince themselves they hadn't been foolish or duped, in Festinger's words, effectively drowning out the internal voice, saying we were wrong with a louder chorus, saying we were right in a different way. This insight that people will go to great lengths to maintain consistency between their beliefs and reality as they perceive it is the crux of cognitive dissonance. The $1 versus $20 experiment, turning boring tasks fun around the same time. Festinger and his colleague James Carl-Smith devised a laboratory experiment to test cognitive dissonance in a controlled setting. In this famous 1959 study, participants were asked to perform mind-numbingly boring tasks. Afterward, the experimenters asked the subjects to do something unexpected, lie to the next participant, actually an actor, by saying the tedious task was actually interesting and fun. For this deceit, some participants were paid $20, a handsome reward in the 1950s. Others were paid only $1, a trivial amount even then importantly. A control group of subjects. Now, one might predict that those paid $20 would feel more positive afterward. After all, they got more money for their trouble. But cognitive dissonance theory predicted the opposite, telling someone, "This task is great," was blatantly inconsistent with participants' true experience. I'm not a liar, yet I just lied that the task was fun. The crucial difference was the amount of justification each group had. Those paid $20 had a clear external justification for fibbing. I did it for the money. $20 was ample reason to lie, so they could admit the task was actually boring without feeling too badly. The lie was justified by the reward. In contrast, those paid $1 had insufficient justification. $1 wasn't enough to comfortably excuse the lie. Why would I deceive someone for just $1? Thus, the $1 group felt more internal dissonance, a thought at odds with their self-image as reasonable, honest people. How to reduce this dissonance? Festinger predicted the $1 participants would unconsciously change their attitude about the task itself to align with their lie. In other words, that it was kind of fun. Actually, this is exactly what happened. When later asked to privately rate how enjoyable the task really was, the $1 participants gave significantly higher ratings. They knew that the task was boring and freely admitted it, because the hefty payment explained away their little white lie. But the $1 participant, lacking a good external excuse, effectively talked themselves into believing the task was interesting to justify the lie and feel consistent. In Festinger's summary, those paid $1 had little justification for lying and should have experienced cognitive dissonance. To reduce the dissonance, they re-evaluated the boring task as interesting and enjoyable. This clever experiment empirically demonstrated cognitive dissonance. When our actions contradict our prior beliefs and we can't attribute it to an external reason, we often change our attitudes to match our actions. How we reduce dissonance. Change, justify, or ignore. Festinger's theory outlines several ways people reduce cognitive dissonance when faced with conflicting ideas. Changing an attitude, convincing yourself the boring task was fun, or adding new justifications, seeking new believers to prove the cult was right more generally. When you experience that uncomfortable, "I'm wrong," or "I'm behaving against my values" feeling, you have a few options. Change one of the conflicting cognitions. Often this means changing your belief or attitude. E.g., maybe the task was actually kind of fun, or maybe the world didn't end because our faith prevented it. This is the path the $1 participant. Altering their perception of reality to fit their prior actions or beliefs. Change your behavior. Sometimes we can resolve dissonance by deciding not to repeat the behavior, e.g., "I feel guilty for lying. I won't do it again." This response is less common in the moment. Instead of admitting the prophecy was false, the cult members could have left the group. But that would mean abandoning a core belief and identity. Humans often resist such drastic change. Add a consonant cognition, justification. Introduce a new thought that makes the inconsistency seem okay. E.g., "I lied about the task because I was helping the experimenter," or "the prophecy failed because we prayed hard." Finding reasons to excuse the conflict without actually resolving it. It's a very common strategy because it allows us to keep both conflicting elements, belief and behavior, but pad them with mental cushion. Trivialize or deny the conflict. Convince yourself that the inconsistency really isn't a big deal. E.g., "It's just a little white lie, not important," or "Actually, I never believed that strongly anyway." By minimizing the significance of the dissonance, the route a person takes depends on which is easier. We tend to pick the path of least psychological resistance, whichever lets us regain mental consistency with minimal damage to our self-esteem or worldview. Notably, changing one's mind to admit "I was wrong" is often the hardest path, especially on deeply held beliefs. Thus, people often favor justifications or mental reframing over genuine change, as Festinger cheekily noted. It is not logic that drives these adjustments. This can lead to astonishing feats of mental gymnastics. Why we rationalize foolish beliefs and bad decisions. Cognitive dissonance. Social psychologists Carol Tavris and Leon Festinger call this process, which is essentially the mind's attempt to resolve dissonance. When we do something that contradicts our image or values, we like to think of ourselves as good smart, and reasonable people. So when we act in ways that are wrong, stupid, or unfair, we feel a jarring dissonance. The fact of our misdeed clashes with our belief in our own goodness. I cheated on that test collides with, I'm an honest person, or I hurt someone conflicts with, I'm a kind. According to Tavris and Aronson, this discomfort is so strong that we often jettison the truth in order to save our egos. Typically, we minimize our own wrong and find external blame. For example, someone who makes a hurtful comment might tell themselves, the other person is oversensitive, or he deserved it, he provoked me. Tavris and Aronson note that a common tactic is denigrating the victim, convincing ourselves they had it coming, so that our harmful action seems justified. This reduces guilt by reframing the scenario. If anything, they were the problem in the book Mistakes Were Made, but not by me. The authors illustrate how almost everyone, from petty criminals to world leaders, uses self-justifications to sleep at night, despite their mistakes. The title itself reflects the attitude, sure, mistakes happen, but not due to my flaws. We create narratives where our intentions were good, our blunders excusable, and our wrong decisions somehow still right. This mental sorcery happens on small and large scales. On the personal level, imagine a person who smokes cigarettes, but knows full well that smoking causes cancer. As health-conscious self-image, I care about my well-being conflicts with the hazardous behavior. To reduce the dissonance, the smoker might latch onto a justification. Well, my grandfather smoked till 90 and he was fine. Life's short, might as well enjoy it, or the stress of quitting is probably worse for me than smoking. These rationalizations. Similarly, someone who spends an exorbitant sum on a new gadget might later defend the purchase with it's totally worth it. I need this to be productive, even if it's hardly used, a way to avoid the dissonance. In countless ways, we all wear what Tavris and Aronson call the blind spots of self-justification biases. Some of the most dramatic examples of self-justification come from professionals who have made serious mistakes, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Tavris and Aronson recount cases of wrongful criminal convictions. Why admitting the mistake would create enormous dissonance. I devoted years to putting this man in jail, but he was innocent. Directly undermines, I am a competent, just law enforcement officer. To reduce that dissonance, insisting, well, maybe he wasn't guilty of this crime, but he's not innocent either, or concocting new theories to justify their original stance. In one example, even after DNA evidence exonerated a prisoner, he was surely guilty of something else. This absurd level of denial highlights how cognitive dissonance. Another example is from the field of psychotherapy in the 1990s, when some therapists were convinced that certain patients had repressed memories of childhood abuse. Yet some therapists ignored the evidence and attacked the scientists who presented it. Why would helpers double down on a harmful debunked practice? Because accepting the studies would mean realizing they had inadvertently hurt their patients, tearing apart families. That realization, I, a healer, actually harmed people, creates unbearable dissonance, which they resolve by rejecting the science and clinging even harder to their original belief. They told themselves the researchers were wrong. This is the dark side of self-justification. It can perpetuate false beliefs and harmful practices. At the heart of these examples is a common theme: our need to protect our self-concept. We'll twist logic into knots to keep believing we are competent, ethical, and right. The distortion is even more powerful when it is motivated by the need to keep our self-concept consistent, by the wish to be right, to preserve self-esteem, or excuse bad decisions. Tavris and Aronson write, in other words, that's why two people can produce entirely different accounts of the same event and genuinely believe their own version. Memory itself becomes a self-justifying storyteller. We aren't lying when we misremember in our favor. Often, we have subconsciously edited the narrative to keep our image intact. As the saying goes, quoted in Mistakes Were Made, history is written by the victors. We are the victors who cast ourselves in the best light. Self-justification, then, is essentially cognitive dissonance in action. It's why we see politicians caught in scandals offering convoluted justifications. It's why, as the book title suggests, all of us find ways to say mistakes were made. Recognizing this human tendency sets the stage for understanding how, in the broader social and political arena. Entire groups of people can become impermeable to facts and reason when their tribal identities or moral commitments, confirmation bias, belief perseverance, and motivated reasoning. These are the cognitive tools we use to uphold our beliefs. Confirmation bias, seeking what confirms. Confirmation bias is the well-documented tendency to seek out, notice, and remember information that confirms our existing beliefs, while neglecting or discounting information that contradicts them. It's as if we have an internal attorney on duty, sifting through reality and collecting only the evidence that will make our case, while deftly objecting to or dismissing any contrary evidence. Psychologists trace the study of confirmation bias back to the 1960s, particularly to the experiments of Peter Wasson in One Classic Task. Wasson showed that people form a hypothesis about a rule and then overwhelmingly look for examples that support the hypothesis. We have a natural inclination to ask, can I find some data that makes me right, rather than is there data that could show me I'm wrong? In theory, rational thinkers should examine both confirming and disconfirming evidence with equal rigor. But in practice, our brains eschewed evidence that fits our prior beliefs is quickly accepted, whereas evidence that contradicts them often faces intense scrutiny or outright rejection. This bias operates in small personal ways and large societal ones, an everyday example. Suppose you have a hunch that a coworker is lazy. You will likely notice every instance that they show up late or miss a deadline, confirming evidence. Over time, your conviction that they're lazy solidifies, bolstered by a biased sample of observations contradictory instances. Well, last week, they did put in extra effort, are brushed aside as exceptions, or simply fail to register. This is confirmation bias reinforcing a stereotype in the age of the internet. This bias has become even more insidious. Given millions of information sources, one can almost always find some article, post, or expert that supports any given belief, from the claim that the earth is flat to elaborate theories. If you want to believe something, the modern media landscape will furnish you with confirming tidbits. Conversely, studies of online behavior find that selective exposure is a common pattern. People tend to click on news headlines or watch videos that align with their existing opinion. As one research review put it, humans have long been known to reduce cognitive dissonance by preferring selective exposure to attitudinally congruent information. In other words, we gravitate toward echo chambers of like-minded information, in part to avoid the dissonance that arises from encountering opposing viewpoints. If reading a news article that disputes your beliefs will make you uneasy or upset, it's psychologically easier to ignore it and click something else over time. This creates a feedback loop. Confirmation bias leads us to consume biased information, which further strengthens our pre-existing beliefs. It's important to note that confirmation bias is often unconscious. We usually don't think, I will ignore this inconvenient fact. Rather, disconfirming evidence simply doesn't feel as relevant or credible to us, so we give it extra weight and readily recall it. Later, we might even interpret ambiguous information in a way that favors our position. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt provides a metaphor when it comes to evaluating our favored beliefs. When it comes to moral or political judgments, Haidt says, but actually we are lawyers arguing for positions we arrived at. By other means, our reasoning powers are often employed to justify what we already feel. We ask, can I believe this about comforting ideas? About discomforting ones. In short, confirmation bias is a kind of intellectual comfort food. We consume what satisfies our mental palate and avoid what might cause cognitive indigestion. Belief perseverance. When beliefs refuse to die, related to confirmation bias is a phenomenon psychologists call belief perseverance. The remarkable stubbornness. Once a belief is formed, it creates a lens through which we view new information, even if that belief originated from faulty evidence or an incorrect assumption. Simply learning it was false. People often continue to persevere in their belief by finding alternate justification or interpretations to keep it alive. In one classic demonstration of belief perseverance, researchers presented participants with evidence of a particular finding, for example, fake data suggesting a link between risk-taking and being a good firefighter. Later, the participants were told that the evidence was completely fabricated, essentially. The rug was pulled out from under the original belief. Rationally, one would expect beliefs to adjust. Oh, if the evidence was fake, I should no longer believe the claim. Yet many participants continued to believe the general idea, e.g., that risk-takers make better firefighters. Or citing other reasons, it could be true they effectively treated the debunked idea as true in spirit, even if not supported by the presented fact. This shows how our mind, once they've latched onto an explanation, resist a full 180-degree turn. We might discard the specific piece of evidence, but keep the conclusion, plugging other rationale into the gap. As a result, beliefs can become untethered from the evidence that spawned them in the first place. Climate change is a prime example. Over decades, scientific evidence, yet individuals who developed a belief that climate change is a hoax or not a serious problem often maintain that stance despite new data. They might dismiss the new evidence as unreliable or interpret normal weather variability as contradicting it, e.g. As one writer put it, people tend to cling to their pre-existing beliefs about how the world works, even when presented with contradicting information. A person convinced that climate change isn't real might wave off record-high global temperatures by saying the data is manipulated, or cherry-pick one cold year in their hometown as proof the scientists are wrong. In this way, the belief perseveres by continually parrying away counter-evidence and sometimes absorbing new, supporting myths, e.g. Actually, it's all a conspiracy by greedy climatologists. Belief perseverance becomes even more striking and problematic when encountering the backfire effect. The backfire effect is a term popularized by researchers Brendan Nehan and Jason Reifler to describe a phenomenon where corrections or evidence that squarely refute a false belief end up strengthening, rather than weakening, that belief in the person's mind. In other words, the ultimate defensive response to cognitive dissonance. Nehan and Reifler first observed this in studies of political misinformation. For example, in one experiment, they presented people with a fake news article containing a false claim, such as Iraq had weapons of mass destruction before the 23 invasion, then later showed some participants a clear factual correction stating that no WMDs were ever found. The rational expectation is that those who saw the correction would be less likely to believe the false claim. What they found was more complex for some groups, particularly those for whom the false belief aligned with their political loyalties. In this case, some conservatives who supported the war. The correction not only failed to convince them, but it made them believe the original false claim more strongly. These participants might respond to the correction by arguing against it, questioning the source, or concocting elaborate reasons why the correction itself was biased or wrong in psychological terms. The contradicting evidence was such a threat to their worldview that it intensified their original conviction as a way to fight back the dissonance. This is the backfire effect. Corrections actually increase misperceptions among the targeted group, essentially boomeranging the attempt at enlightenment. It's worth noting that not everyone reacts this way. The backfire effect doesn't occur in all situations. In the same studies, other participants with different political leanings did accept the correction and adjusted their beliefs accordingly. Later research has suggested that the backfire effect might be less common or more conditional than initially feared. Many people can update beliefs in response to evidence. Still, the concept remains important in understanding why directly confronting someone with facts can so often seem futile in changing their mind, especially on polarizing topics. The more that beliefs are tied to identity or ideology, the more a person has at stake, and the more likely they are to mount a cognitive defense. Or that's just what they want you to think. The dissonance of possibly being wrong is avoided by attacking the source or rationalizing the contradiction, leaving the core belief intact. In summary, belief perseverance and backfire effects show the tenacity of our convictions once we have taken a stand. Right or wrong, pure reason and evidence alone often struggle to penetrate. The mind can be a formidable echo chamber for its own prior beliefs, a kind of belief echo that keeps bouncing around even after the initial sound evidence is removed. To really understand why this is so pronounced today, we need to zoom out and look at the social context in which our reasoning happens. Nowhere are these psychological tendencies more evident than in the realm of modern media and politics. And tribal polarization have become defining features. Let's examine how the information age has supercharged our ability to indulge confirmation bias. The echo chamber effect, social media, and selective information in the digital era. Many of us live in echo chambers or filter bubbles, environments often online where we predominantly encounter information that echoes our own beliefs and rarely encounter challenging viewpoints. This term isn't just metaphorical. It describes a literal curation of information around each of us through a combination of personal choice and algorithmic curation. Our media feeds tend to serve us the perspectives we want to hear. Cass Sunstein, a scholar who has written extensively on this, which can lead to self-sorting into virtual gated communities of like-minded people. The unintended result is that instead of being broadened by the internet's vast information, many people end up more insulated than ever, drawing from a shrinking pool of news that reinforces their pre-existing views. Why do echo chambers form so easily? Part of the answer lies in basic human tendencies. A lot of people love reading things that fortify and confirm their own opinions. Given freedom of choice, people often self-segregate intellectually, consuming media that aligns with their beliefs and avoiding what doesn't. This self-sorting is then amplified by the algorithms running platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. The algorithms learn what you like, the posts you interact with, the videos you watch longer, and then feed you more of the same, creating a feedback loop. If you click on articles critical of one political party, soon your suggested news is filled with critiques of that party. If you enjoy videos promoting a conspiracy theory, the platform may recommend even more extreme conspiracy content. Next, tech scholar Zeynep Tufekci has argued that YouTube's recommendation algorithm, for instance, can gradually radicalize users by leading them toward increasingly polarizing content. The infamous rabbit hole effect: you start with a relatively mild video, and the algorithm suggests a slightly more provocative one next, and so on, nudging towards extremes. Though, it should be noted, newer studies have challenged how inevitable this effect is. In echo chambers, cognitive dissonance is kept to a minimum by design. If your newsfeed is 90% content that aligns with your views, it's a comfortable place, psychologically a steady validation that your side is right. On the flip side, when we do encounter opposing information, perhaps via a friend's post, our narrative, for example, someone deeply embedded in a partisan echo chamber might genuinely believe everyone knows X, where X is their group's belief, because they never see the counter-arguments. This creates a false sense of consensus, a false consensus effect, where each side thinks their view is obviously the reasonable one and anyone who disagrees must be a fringe or misled element. Social media experiments have shown that when people are exposed only to attitudinally congruent news, say, a feed full of messages agreeing with their stance, they come to overestimate how much the general public supports their opinion. In other words, echo chambers can foster extreme overconfidence in the righteousness and popularity of one's views more dangerously. Echo chambers can contribute to what Sunstein calls, when like-minded people converse exclusively with each other, their views tend to become more extreme and entrenched than they were before. Imagine a group of moderately skeptical people discussing vaccines in an anti-vaccine forum. As they share anecdotes and selectively cite sources, all anti-vax, of course, they may reinforce each other's fears and move toward more radical rejection of vaccines. The group's average stance shifts further to the extreme. The same happens on the political left and right. If Republicans talk only to Republicans, if Democrats talk only to Democrats, they'll become more extreme. Each side not only preaches to its choir, but sharpens the choir's doctrine. This polarization makes compromise difficult and fuels mutual mistrust. As each side's picture of reality drifts apart, Sunstein notes that in Washington, D.C., such group polarization has made sensible compromises rare and has eroded the capacity for people to learn from one another. After all, if your group has moved further out and become convinced that we are absolutely right and they are absolutely wrong, why bother listening to the other side? Another facet of the online echo chamber is the prevalence of misinformation and conspiracy theories. In a homogeneous group, deviant opinions are excluded, which sometimes means factual correctives are missing. If everyone in your Facebook group believes a certain conspiracy, they all echo and amplify the same claim, giving them an illusion of credibility through repetition. And if an outsider comes in to refute it, the group is likely to dismiss that person as uninformed or hostile. The result is that false beliefs can incubate and strengthen. We've seen this with various forms of misinformation. For example, groups dedicated to flat earth theories or miracle health cures create self-reinforcing research communities within their echo chamber. They cite each other's YouTube videos and blogs as evidence, laugh off mainstream science as lies. Selective exposure and confirmation. Bias are on overdrive. Every piece of content that circulates in the group confirms the group's belief. Over time, members can become deeply convinced of ideas that appear utterly baseless to outsiders. Mainstream political discourse also shows this pattern. Consider how different the media universes of, say, a liberal Democrat and a conservative Republican can look. One watches MSNBC, reads the New York Times, and curates a Twitter feed of progressive voices on any given issue, be it climate change, election integrity, a pandemic. These two people might receive entirely different sets of facts, expert opinions, and moral outrage. Each lives in a matrix, as Jonathan Haidt calls it. Haidt vividly describes how, when we sort ourselves into like-minded communities, each side lives in a separate moral universe with its own facts, its own experts, and simply cannot be penetrated by arguments from the other side. You can't just throw arguments. It will bounce right off. This is why debates on social media so often devolve into stalemates or flame war. People aren't engaging with the content of the evidence so much as they're signaling loyalty to their team and drawing from their team's pool of counter-evidence. In short, the modern information ecosystem often serves as a giant dissonance avoidance machine. It has never been easier to surround ourselves. Just unfollow, mute, block, or switch the channel. While this certainly makes life more comfortable, in the short term, nobody enjoys constant arguments in their feed. It has profound consequences for society. Polarization intensifies, common ground shrinks. The stage is set for a world in which cognitive dissonance, when it does occur, is immediately soothed by a supportive chorus, and where changing one's mind becomes rarer and more difficult now. Let's delve specifically into how these forces play out in the realm of politics and contentious issues today. How do polarization and identity interact with cognitive dissonance? Polarization and identity. When politics becomes tribal. It's often said that politics in many countries, certainly in the US, more about group identity and loyalty than about policy details or factual debates in such an environment. Cognitive dissonance and its reduction take on a collective form. The question is no longer just how do I reconcile this conflicting information with my beliefs? This is where the concept of identity protective cognition comes in. Scholar Dan Kahan uses this term to describe how people's reasoning can become contorted. Basically, individuals will unconsciously dismiss evidence that contradicts the dominant beliefs of their group, because accepting it would create dissonance, not only internally, but socially. It could alienate them from their tribe. In Kahan's words, people have a tendency to unconsciously dismiss evidence. Our reasoning is motivated by something other than pure truth-seeking. In this case, the motivation is to fit in and uphold our group's worldview. Consider how this plays out on polarizing scientific issues like climate change or vaccine safety. It's not that physics works differently for conservatives and liberals. For many conservatives, accepting the reality of human-caused climate change. For many liberals, expressing doubt about climate change would clash with their team's pro-science. Each person is embedded in a community that has positions which have, over time, become part of the group's identity or sacred values. In a political tribe, certain issues become sacralized badges of loyalty. To question them is heresy. Haidt gives the example of how American conservatives sacralized no new taxes as an inviolable principle, while American liberals, any evidence or argument against it, is often automatically rejected to avoid moral and social dissonance. Both sides are blind to evidence around their sacred commitment. Haidt notes, Dan Kahan's research, the most educated and analytically skilled individuals are often the most polarized because they become extremely adept at arguing for their group's position. In other words, raw intelligence or scientific literacy doesn't necessarily reduce bias. Sometimes it arms the bias. Kahan found, for example, that on issues like climate change or gun control, people with higher numeracy skills or general science knowledge were better at interpreting data in a way that supported their pre-existing stance. Their proficiency was being used in service of motivated reasoning, a kind of system to deliberative rationalization rather than objective analysis. As he explains, the people who are most polarized are also the most cognitively proficient. They're engaging information in a way that's most relevant to their life. If accepting certain evidence would alienate them from their community and no individual's personal acceptance of climate science, then resisting the evidence is the rational social strategy. This is a sobering point. From the individual's perspective, motivated reasoning to align with your group makes sense. It maintains harmony with friends, family, and colleagues who share your worldview. It protects your social standing and sense of belonging. The cost is simply the accuracy of your beliefs about impersonal facts, which might have little immediate impact on your day-to-day life. Thus, in a very real way, people may unconsciously think, what's more dangerous to me, being wrong about climate change? For many, the latter is a bigger threat, a kind of social death, and so they unconsciously choose group loyalty over factual correctness. We're not just discussing data, we're defending identities. When someone challenges your stance on immigration, gun rights, or any hot-button issue, your very self, that's why arguments can get heated and why evidence is quickly politicized. The discussion isn't happening in a vacuum of reason. It's happening in a social crucible where each participant is aware consciously. Let's bring this down to concrete examples. Take the case of vaccine skepticism. For some communities, both in certain wellness alternative health circles and in some conservative political circles, when confronted with robust evidence that vaccines are safe and effective, a person deeply embedded in the anti-vax community faces a serious quandary. Accept the evidence. Will my friends think I've drunk the Kool-Aid, or stick to their beliefs and dismiss the evidence as just propaganda from big pharma or government shills? The cognitive dissonance evidence says I'm wrong versus my group says we're right. Or shifting the goalposts. Okay, maybe that study shows no link to autism, but vaccines still have too many toxins. This way, they avoid the painful process of admitting error and maintain their standing in their community. Indeed, in one study, giving vaccine-hesitant parents factual information debunking the myth that MMR vaccines made anti-vaccine attitudes more entrenched, a possible backfire effect. The parents, motivated by concerns for their children and distrust of authorities, they must be hiding something. The dissonance between official facts and their ingrained beliefs led not to enlightenment, but to further resist. Another modern case, the belief among some political conservatives in the US that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, despite a lack of evidence and numerous court rulings. For those who fervently supported Donald Trump, his loss was not just a disappointment. It was a blow to a worldview in which their side is destined to win against what they see as corrupt opponents. It quickly became a core tenet in certain circles now, presenting evidence that the claims of fraud were false. For instance, the recounts and audits that upheld the results, or the absence of any credible proof in court cases. Instead, they may incorporate those facts into a wider conspiracy narrative. The judges are in on it. The audit was rigged. To doubt it might be seen as disloyal to the political tribe. We can see echoes of Festinger's prophecy study here. Just as Mistress Keach's cult members clung to belief after a failed prediction, many conspiracy-fueled political movements, QAnon, a modern conspiracy movement, repeatedly had its prophecies dates when mass arrests of evil politicians would occur. For example, failed to materialize, and yet many followers simply adjusted the narrative. The timeline changed. The prophecy was metaphorical. Trust the plan, and even grew the community in the aftermath. exactly as Festinger observed in the 1950s. It's important to highlight that this is not a one-sided phenomenon. Motivated reasoning affects all sides of the spectrum. While one group might deny climate science, another group might deny, say, evidence that a favored social program isn't working as intended, or might excuse unethical behavior by their political allies that they would condemn an opponent's. Haidt points out that whether left or right, both sides are blind to evidence around their sacred commitment. For instance, if progressive activists treat certain groups as sacrosanct victims who can do no wrong, they might downplay data that complicates that narrative, like crime statistics or policy backfires. Ammo to the outgroup. Conversely, if conservatives canonize free market capitalism, they might resist evidence of market failures or injustices. Each side has sacred values: equality and care for one, freedom and loyalty for the other, for example. That can become unassailable when those values are in play. Arguments become religious in fervor. People don't just disagree, they see dissent as blasphemy. Thus, debates become more about demonizing the other side than about finding truth. My side is right. The more we encase our beliefs in the armor of identity, the more any contrary evidence will bounce off that armor. To sum up, political polarization supercharges cognitive dissonance by adding layers of social and moral significance to our belief. Changing your mind about a factual matter isn't just an intellectual exercise, an act of treachery. No wonder people often choose to rationalize or deny rather than concede. The consequences are visible. National debates where each side lives in what Haidt calls consensual hallucinations, an atmosphere where presenting factual corrections or different views often just leads to each faction digging in deeper. However, understanding these forces is the first step to figuring out how we might mitigate them, a topic we'll return to when we discuss promoting intellectual humility. Before that, let's reinforce our understanding with a few contemporary case studies that tie everything together: classic cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, modern case studies, dissonance in action. To make these concepts even more concrete, let's briefly look at a few modern examples where cognitive dissonance and related biases manifest clearly. 1. Climate change denial. As touched on earlier, the divide over climate change provides a textbook example. The overwhelming majority of climate scientists, yet a segment of the public, often aligned with certain political ideologies, remains skeptical or denies the problem's severity. Cognitive dissonance comes into play. Accepting climate change would imply that burning fossil fuels is harmful, and perhaps we need government action, which conflicts with their free market, pro-industry beliefs. To reduce this dissonance, they may question the science. Experts themselves, it's easy to say, I don't understand all the data, so I'm not convinced, or embrace confirmation bias, sources that tell them what they want to hear, e.g., fringe scientists or pundits who argue climate change is a hoax or natural cycle. Within their echo chambers, they circulate occasional cold weather anecdotes. It snowed in Texas this year, so much for global warming, as evidence that the scientists are wrong, while ignoring long-term global trends. Even as record heat waves and storms intensify, a climate skeptic can perpetuate their belief by attributing these to other causes or claiming it's all exaggerated. Their peers echo similar views, so there's social reinforcement too. The result is a belief perseverance effect. The belief that climate change isn't a real threat persists despite mounting contrary evidence, and attempts to correct it can backfire if seen as partisan attack. When a liberal politician advocates for climate action, some conservatives instinctively dismiss the message because of the messenger, doubling down on their skepticism as a political statement. 2. Vaccine misinformation and health belief. The fight against COVID-19 provided many instances of cognitive dissonance dynamics. Consider someone who was initially skeptical of COVID vaccine, perhaps influenced by online misinformation, claiming the vaccines were unsafe or part of some nefarious scheme. As billions of doses have been administered globally and scientific trials showed strong safety and efficacy, that person faces increasing contrary evidence. Many in that situation shifted the goalposts of their argument or latched onto any new rumor to justify maintaining their stance. For example, when vaccines proved effective at reducing severe illness, skeptics seized on breakthrough infections to claim People still get COVID, so the vaccine doesn't work. Focusing narrowly on a confirmatory angle while ignoring the larger protective benefits, or they might emphasize rare side effects. When acquaintances got vaccinated and stayed healthy, that evidence might be dismissed as well. Maybe it'll cause issues long term. We just don't see it yet. This is classic belief perseverance. The core belief vaccines are bad stays intact by continuously cooking up new rationales or cherry-picking data. Some people who fell ill and were hospitalized with COVID still refused treatments. In extreme cases, as nurses reported, dying patients insisted it must be something else killing them, not COVID, as that belief was too deeply embedded. This highlights how identity and community played roles. Anti-vaccine or anti-mask beliefs often became part of a broader identity tied to personal freedom and distrust of authorities to accept the virus's reality or the vaccine's benefit. That dissonance, all my favorite pundits said this was overblown. But here I am, seriously sick, is agonizing, so some resolve it by clinging to denial even to the end. Many others in those situations did express regret. Cognitive dissonance is powerful, but it can be overcome by undeniable reality. The tragedy is when it's not overcome in time. 3. Conspiracy theories and QAnon. Modern conspiracy theory movements offer vivid illustrations of Festinger's prophecy. Fails in a new guise. QAnon is a sprawling conspiracy theory community that began in 2017 around anonymous online postings. Q claiming a cabal of elites would soon be exposed and brought to justice by President Trump. Followers believed in specific predictions, like the storm, a day of mass arrests of this alleged cabal. Dates were implicitly or explicitly given, but each came and went with no such event. Did the believers abandon the theory? Many did not. Instead, they performed mental gymnastics to keep it alive. Maybe the timeline was shifted. Maybe behind-the-scenes victories happened invisibly. Some even claimed the predictions did come true in secret. They sought out new interpretations and often became even more vocal. Effectively, what Festinger's cultists did, far from disproof killing the movement. In some ways, it emboldened the hardcore believers to recruit and proselytize. We saw social media floods of QAnon content increase after disappointment. It's a poignant example of how echo chambers online can sustain a belief system that continually fails empirical tests. Each failure is rationalized. Forums buzz with explanations and new theories, drowning out the voice of reality with a deluge of consonant reassurances. Trust the plan. This is a necessary part of the chess game. People in these communities often form strong social bonds, calling each other patriots or truth seekers. You're not just questioning a claim, you'd be leaving a community and potentially losing friends. This social cost glues people to the belief. We saw similar patterns around election fraud conspiracies. After 2020, every lawsuit failure or audit confirmation was met with an alternative story, propagated within partisan media bubbles that kept hope alive. Meanwhile, on mainstream news, those same events were seen as conclusive debunks. It's as if two different movies were playing, one where the conspiracy is always on the verge of vindication, the other where it's decisively disproven, and people chose which movie to watch based on their confirmation biases and media silence. 4. Identity politics and personal beliefs. On a slightly different note, consider how individuals manage dissonance when their personal experiences conflict with their group stance. For example, a devout member of a religious or ideological community might encounter a life event or evidence that contradicts a strict doctrine of the group. Say a person raised in an anti-LGBT environment discovers that their child or friend is gay and is a kind, normal person. My group says this is immoral, bad, but my experience tells me this person is good and this is just who they are. How to reconcile. Some might change their beliefs over time. We see many anecdotes of personal connections shifting people's attitudes on social issues. Others, however, might experience identity protective reasoning kicking in. They might distance themselves from the person or double down on doctrine to avoid the painful conflict. Alternatively, they might compartmentalize love the sinner, hate the sin as a way to still view the person positively, but not relinquish the doctrinal belief. This shows the human capacity to find psychological compromises to maintain multiple commitments. Tavris. One way people reduce dissonance in relationships is by reinterpreting the behavior of loved ones, rather than changing beliefs about them. For instance, he only hurt me because he was under stress. He's really a good person. Preserving the belief my partner is good by explaining away bad behavior in the political realm. We often see supporters of a politician excuse scandalous action. This double standard is facilitated by dissonance reduction. We cut slack for our in-group to keep our overall narrative intact. My side are the good guys must be preserved. These examples highlight that cognitive dissonance, from global issues like climate and health to the intimacies of our social circles, especially those tied to identity or deeply held values, we often engage defensive mental habits to restore consistency. Sometimes that leads to absurd denials of reality. Other times, understanding this should invite some compassion. It's a fundamentally human reaction to protect our psyche, but also urgency in figuring out how to break these cycles, at least when they become harmful, as in public health crises or undermining democracy. What do psychologists and thinkers suggest we do about this? How can we, as individuals and as a society, manage cognitive dissonance in a healthier way? In the final section, we'll explore how awareness of these mental traps can cultivate intellectual humility, improve how we handle disagreement, and perhaps make us wiser decision makers. We'll hear advice from experts on challenging our own biases toward intellectual humility. Learning from dissonance. We are all vulnerable to being wrong, and our minds will often work overtime to convince us we're right. This isn't a personal failing so much as a human condition. Realizing this is the first step toward what's known as intellectual humility, the virtue of recognizing the limits of our knowledge. In a polarized age, cultivating intellectual humility and better discourse. Firstly, simply being aware of dissonance as it happens within us can be powerful. The next time you feel that twist in your stomach or that flare of defensiveness when someone challenges you, that could be cognitive dissonance talking. Instead of immediately rationalizing or firing back, one can learn to pause and examine that discomfort. Tavris and Leon Festinger emphasize the value of having a few trusted naysayers in our lives. We need a few trusted naysayers in our lives, critics who are willing to puncture our protective bubble of self-justifications and yank us back to reality if we veer too far off. They write, it's a wonderful piece of advice. Instead of surrounding ourselves only with yes men or yes algorithms feeding our biases, we should invite critical feedback. It can be uncomfortable. These naysayers might induce dissonance by pointing out our mistakes or flawed assumptions, but if they're trusted friends or respected colleagues, over time, getting that external check can save us from doubling down on wrong-headed paths. Jonathan Haidt offers a complementary insight. The only cure for the confirmation bias is other people. No single individual, no matter how smart, is immune to biased reasoning. Haidt points out that the way science ideally arrives at truth is not by each scientist being perfectly rational, but by the community of scientists challenging and correcting each other's claims. I've got my theory and I'm really good at justifying it, but fortunately there's peer review. There are lots of people who are really good at undercutting it, he notes. We end up being forced to work together, challenging each other's confirmation. If you can engage with people who disagree with you in good faith, each of you can help the other see blind spots, the key ingredient. As Haidt says, are a sense of friendship or common humanity and a shared goal or institution that you both care about. If you have some basic trust, you're more likely to actually listen rather than just debate. That's why fostering respectful dialogue across differences is so important. It's not just a nice ideal, it's the practical antidote to each side's confirmation bias in our current climate. This might mean intentionally following a few social media accounts from the other side that you find reasonable, just to get exposure to a different perspective. Or it could mean engaging in community forums or dialogue groups that bring diverse people together. It might feel awkward at first, but the payoff is that you'll be less sealed in an echo chamber, and you might catch your own potential errors earlier. Intellectual humility also means being willing to say, I don't know, or I was wrong. This is hard. Our ego resists it, but it's incredibly liberating once you get used to it. Rather than seeing a change of mind as a sign of weakness, a great nation is like a great man. When he makes a mistake, he realizes it. Having realized it, he admits it. Having admitted it, he corrects it. He considers those who point out his faults as his most benevolent teachers. Imagine if we as individuals and our leaders and institutions admitting error or ignorance shouldn't be shameful. It should be seen as honorable, a step toward getting it right in science. There's a saying that failure or refutation isn't a disaster. It's an information-rich result that brings you closer to the truth. Likewise, in personal beliefs, discovering you were wrong about something means you've learned something new. It's like course-correcting a ship that was a bit off. Correcting a ship that was a bit off. In the long run, you'll get to a better destination. One practical tip often suggested by psychologists: treat it like an experiment. If you strongly believe X, ask, what would it take to convince me otherwise? What evidence, hypothetically, would change my mind? Then actually go look for whether that evidence exists. If you can't imagine anything that would change your mind, that's a flag that the belief might be more about identity or emotion than objective truth. Perhaps even write down the pros and cons of both sides, or discuss with someone who holds the opposite view, in a spirit of understanding rather than debate. In essence, test your hypothesis. Don't just assume it. Dan Kahan's work suggests another approach. Focus on curiosity and shared values rather than brute facts when communicating across divides. If people fear that accepting a fact will threaten their identity, sometimes the solution is to decouple the fact from identity. For example, with climate change, some communicators found more success by framing solutions rather than save the polar bears, which some may dismiss as a partisan trope. This way, acknowledging the reality of the problem doesn't feel like joining the other team, but rather approaching it from one's own team's values. On an interpersonal level, if you're trying to convince someone of something, it helps to affirm their dignity or good intentions first. If you reduce their self-threat, they may be more open. Carol Tavris suggests that if you want someone to admit a mistake, it helps to say something like, I know you're a good person, and you were trying to do the right thing. This mistake is understandable and fixable. That way, you're not triggering as much dissonance in them, because you're not implying you're bad stupid, which would only make them defensive. Instead, you're giving them a face-saving path to change. They can update their stance without feeling like their core self is attacked. From a societal perspective, reducing polarization might involve systemic changes that increase exposure to diverse perspectives. Sunstein speaks of an architecture of serendipity, designing online platforms or public spaces to inject a bit of randomness and cross-cutting exposure. For example, maybe social media feeds could deliberately show you a news piece from a reliable source that you wouldn't normally follow. In our own media consumption, we can cultivate serendipity by occasionally reading outside our usual circuit or engaging with someone we respectfully disagree with. The goal isn't to constantly seek conflict. Nobody wants to live in perpetual argument, but to ensure we're not in an information monoculture that leaves us blindsided and error-prone. Promoting better discourse also means moralizing certain norms of conversation. Haidt suggests we moralize. In other words, make it a point of pride to engage civilly and assume the best of the other's intentions. Praising those who can charitably summarize their opponent's view, sometimes called steel-manning their argument, we could reduce the reflexive defensiveness. After all, if you know the person you're talking with isn't going to call you names for changing your mind, you'd be more open to reconsideration. It's when every issue is framed as a battle of good versus evil that people feel they can't yield an inch out. Ultimately, embracing the lessons of cognitive dissonance leads to a form of grace towards ourselves and others. We'll inevitably catch ourselves rationalizing or see others in denial, and instead of scorn, we can respond with understanding. That's cognitive dissonance doing its thing. I have that too. How can we gently move past it? It reminds us that changing one's mind is hard work and often emotionally uncomfortable. So when someone does come around on a tough issue, likewise, we should be kinder to ourselves when we realize we were wrong being wrong. If you can accept that, of course you'll be wrong about many things in life, as everyone is. It becomes less painful to admit it. You start seeing it as growth rather than defeat. In closing, cognitive dissonance, for all the trouble it causes, is also a clue to something deeply hopeful. It signals that we care about consistency, truth, and doing right. We don't want to be hypocrites or fools. That's why dissonance hurts. That means deep down, we value integrity and truthfulness by facing our dissonance instead of reflexively smoothing it over. It might sting at first, like a muscle being stretched, but that's how we become more flexible thinkers and more resilient individuals in an age of polarization. If more of us can be self-aware, embrace a bit of humility, and reach across divides, we can transform cognitive dissonance from a source of division into a driver of dialogue. As the old guru in the story told the man seeking the secret to a happy life, good judgment. Well, that comes from bad judgment. We will all have moments of bad judgment or false belief. The key is to learn from them, not entrench them. So the next time you feel that uncomfortable twinge, that is the feeling of your mind being stretched, learning something new instead of doubling down. Consider that letting go might lead you to better understand. As Lao Tzu implied, strength and greatness come not from never erring, but from recognizing and correcting our errors. By applying that wisdom, we can each do our part to foster a culture of open-mindedness, honest discourse, and that is a belief worth doubling down on.